Water. It holds a special place in our lives, doesn't it? We drink it, we play in it, we bathe in it, and find peace in its presence. As you use, we even set aside a day each year to honor its significance. 16 years ago, Reverend Bonnie Dlott, our minister emerita, delivered a powerful sermon called The River Why, and it resonated deeply with Vicki and me. It helped us to understand how rivers symbolize the cycle of life and death, the transformative power of water, and our interconnectedness with all living things. For me, it was a particularly poignant message coming just 9 months after my husband's sudden death. Reverend Bonnie's words spoke straight to my heart, acknowledging life's fragility and beauty. Isn't it remarkable that a decade after her trip down the Rogue River, Bonnie was shockingly and directly faced with her own mortality, only to emerge with a renewed appreciation for every moment of this precious life. Now, as she embarks on a new chapter as Grand Reverend Ma to her precious new grandchildren, so I have pictures to show you after, if you'd like, but her son Glade has a daughter named Ursula, and her daughter Rachel has a son named Peregrine, who is nicknamed Pippin from The Lord of the Rings. Isn't that adorable? Yes, Bonnie is reminded, and so are we, that life's circle continues to unfold. So today, Vicki and I are going to revisit the River Why and hope that its wisdom inspires us to cherish every instant and to honor the beauty that surrounds us. Vicki's got a little something and is going to start.
How many of you have taken a river rafting trip? Good. Okay. So you remember that rapids are rated, correct? And I'm going to just run through the classes of rapids briefly before I start my reading of Bonnie's sermon. So class 1 is easy, right? You just float down the river and barely have a ripple that touches you. Class 2 is medium. The rapids flow of low difficulty with passage is clear. They're suitable for everyone. No experience necessary. A guide is preferable for these rapids, but not required. Then class 3, moderate. Waves numerous, high, irregular, rocks, eddies, rapids with passages clear through narrow, requiring experience in maneuvering. No previous experience is necessary. Sounds to me like I would need some help with that one. Class 4, difficult, long rapids, waves powerful, irregular, dangerous rocks, boiling eddies, powerful and precise maneuvering required. Have an experienced guide with you. Previous experience is helpful but not necessary. Class 5, extremely difficult, exceedingly difficult, long and violent rapids following each other mostly without interruption, riverbed extremely obstructed, big drops, violent currents, very steep gradient. Paddlers should have prior class 4 or better whitewater experience with experienced guides who know the river. Okay, one more, class 6. Unrunnable. Just like it says, don't even think about it. These constitute waterfalls and other death traps that should not be attempted. So the sermon today involves mainly, I think, class 1, 2, and 3. I don't know if there's a 4 in there, but I know when Gordon and I did the Rogue River, seems like there was class 4 everywhere, but I probably don't remember it. It just seems like it. So here is Bonnie's sermon from 2008 in August, The River Why. For some of us, the word vacation conjures up the version of an empty beach, a few palm trees, and maybe an unnaturally colored drink with an umbrella stuck in it. Somehow, this kind of vacation has always eluded me. When recalling memorable childhood vacations, my visions usually include a Volkswagen van with no air conditioning, packed with my parents, 5 siblings, and perhaps a cousin or two, breaking down in the Arizona desert, or sleeping on the snow in Kings Canyon National Park during a spring backpacking trip, or staying up all night stoking a bonfire in the Trinity Alps to keep the bears out of our food. I've always dreamed of taking a summer vacation that didn't involve some life-threatening activity, but it hasn't happened yet. This summer was no exception. My choice of vacation was to spend 4 days rafting down the Rogue River in southern Oregon. The Rogue is a stunningly beautiful river with its headwaters at Crater Lake. It twists and turns for about 215 miles through the Cascades, Siskiyou, and coastal regions before spilling into the Pacific Ocean at Gold Beach. The thought of drifting down the Rogue in a raft kept me going all last spring. Rafting down a river with some really fun Class 3 rapids may not sound like a relaxing vacation to some of you, but compared to the rafting trips my dad took us on when I was a kid, I thought this was going to be a snap. We were going with a rafting company. They would provide all the meals and even set up our tents. Imagine, no raft to inflate, no meals to plan, no food to haul, no dishes to wash up. And best of all, professional guides who would certainly be interested in our long-term survival. This would be in contrast to the trips I took with my father on the Klamath River. He denies it, but I really think he enjoyed the feeling of not knowing exactly what was coming around the next bend. I also got the sense that he felt it wasn't really a successful vacation unless we capsized. But this would be different. Nothing to do but enjoy the river and the scenery. Perhaps it would even be relaxing.
Reality soon set in. My brilliant plan of having my two teens drive most of the way to Oregon in order to practice their driving skills did not help me to relax. What was I thinking? By the time we reached our destination for the night, the Oregon caves, I was ready to taste some fine local wines, which we did. We were amused to see a local beer called Dead Guy Ale, brewed by the Rogue Brewery, which we then had to taste, in a bit of ominous foreshadowing. We survived the final leg of the journey to the Galice Resort on the banks of the Rogue, where we met up with our 4 young guides. We were instructed to be back at 8 a.m. the next morning with our waterproof duffels packed, sunscreen to the hilt, ready to roll. The next morning, we met our guides and the other members of our party and headed down the river, where we got the whole safety talk. We put on the life preservers. Those of us who wanted to take the kayaks put on helmets. Our head guide, Mark, talked about the higher than usual water level and flow and briefed us about basic river safety. If we fall out of the raft, we are to float feet first. If we fall out in rapids, we need to ride them out because the rafts won't be able to stop for us. If we need to pull someone out of the water, hold on to the life jacket and don't pull on the arms. He reminded us that people drowned regularly on the river, but that mostly these accidents involve folks who aren't wearing life jackets or who have been drinking. But accidents do happen, he said, even when you are doing everything right. Just this week, he added soberly, someone had drowned on the very stretch of water we would be on. So much for my relaxing vacation. Even so, the first 2 days of the trip were very enjoyable. We had 4 large rafts that carried our gear, and 3 had room to ride in if one wanted to relax and just look at the scenery. Our other option was to ride in the inflatable kayaks, either alone or with a partner. About half of our party of 13 opted to ride in kayaks the whole time, and the other half chose the raft so they could watch birds and take pictures. When we arrived at our camp each evening, our tents were set up and cold drinks were waiting for us. Our guides were accomplished cooks and experienced storytellers, and we enjoyed listening to some very colorful tales about the history of the Rogue River area, including how it acquired its name. This is dated. The native people who originally inhabited the area were particularly troublesome to the French, who were the first white men to explore this territory, so they dubbed them the Rogues. The French then extended the name to the region and then next to the river because it was such an integral part of the lives of the Indians. And of course, the French worked very hard to exterminate native people, an effort that was completed by the gold miners who flocked to the area in the 1850s.
Just in case my foreshadowing has made you anxious, I want to assure you that our party incurred no fatalities except for the 2 minuscule fish that I caught. Apparently, July is not peak fishing time on the Rogue, but I love to fish and spent a few blissful hours by myself casting into the currents. It wasn't until the 3rd night of our trip that we heard the whole story about the woman who had died on the river the week before we arrived. That was the day we rafted through Blossom Bar, the only Class 4 rapid on our trip. On the morning we were to run through Blossom Bar, our guides told us that we wouldn't be allowed to take the kayaks on this stretch because it was too dangerous. They would take the kayaks through themselves and then climb back over the rocks to bring us through on the rafts. The reason for this was that there was a notorious strainer called the picket fence about halfway down. A strainer is just what it sounds like, a place where water rushes through brush and rocks, creating a serious hazard for folks who end up in the water. If you get trapped by a strainer, it can be impossible to swim free of it, and you can drown quickly, even if you are wearing a life jacket. As it turns out, Blossom Bar was where the woman had drowned, at the very place we were going to pass through right at the picket fence. She was in an inflatable kayak, and she was wearing her life vest. She was on a guided tour, just like we were. But that company had let folks take their kayaks through Blossom Bar, despite the high water levels. After she had capsized, she had helped a younger woman who was with her to safety before being swept into the strainer. Extracting her body proved impossible because of the water currents, and despite a heroic attempt that nearly took another life, she remained pinned in the water for over a week. The day we started our journey on the river, she had finally floated free and her body was recovered. I'm sure this was a relief to our guides, as apparently her swimsuit was visible to others riding through the rapids.
We had our own mishaps that day before we even came to Blossom Bar, in an area of the river that passes through Mule Creek Canyon. This canyon is about a half a mile long and is quite intimidating due to the speed of the water, the steep rock walls, and the unpredictable currents and boils. There is not much room to maneuver in the canyon, and our guides cautioned us that some skill would be required to keep from capsizing. We were advised that should we fall out, we would have a long swim to the end of the canyon. I opted to get in the raft at this point, but my husband and son decided to stay in the kayaks. The first rapid past the entrance of the canyon is the Class 3 called Jaws. The next one is called Coffee Pot, named after its percolating action. My husband and his friend made it through Jaws, only to capsize as they tried to re-enter the current from an eddy where they rested for a moment. Rick, Bonnie's husband, got caught in a boil just above Coffee Pot. When it looked like he was having trouble swimming out of it, one of our guides swung into action. He commandeered a kayak from another member of our party and left the occupants of his raft hanging on to a rock. He paddled into the rapid and pulled Rick out, took him down to the end of the rapid, jumped out, climbed back up over the rocks, and scaled back down the steep canyon wall where the occupants of his raft waited. I was happy that I didn't witness any of this, as it was bad enough just waiting below the canyon in the raft for the kayaks to come through. It felt like an hour before the last one appeared, although it was possibly no more than 10 minutes. After all that excitement, passing through Blossom Bar on the rafts was a piece of cake. Those of us who opted to stay in the rafts got to hear all about it at dinner that night, where there was much toasting to our guides for keeping us alive. I was very proud of my son and daughter, who each had the nerve to spend time in solo kayaks and each managed to get back in after being dumped out. I took particular pleasure in the fact that Glade managed to flip his kayak end over end, a feat that our guides had assured us was not possible. I felt relieved and sad that this was the last night of our adventure, and this was when we heard the whole story about the woman who had drowned. Her body had been recovered right at the spot we spent our last night on the river. I spent the day of our trip in a single kayak, enjoying the solitude. I saw mink and deer on the shore and watched osprey hunting for fish. I found it difficult not to think about the woman who had lost her life on Blossom Bar. She was from Southern California, and she was only a few years older than I. I wondered what she would have thought about the way she died. I imagined people would say things like, she died doing something she loved, or she sacrificed her life for someone else. Maybe, maybe not. I'll never know, but I couldn't get her out of my mind. Once we'd hit our hotel in Gold Beach, I looked at the news coverage of the drowning at Blossom Bar. There was a lively discussion on the blogs about the fact that the woman's body was in the river for so long. One person wrote that they should have tried much harder to get her body out, even if it meant risking rescuers' lives. Another person wrote that they should have reduced the flow in the river enough to retrieve her. When someone else pointed out that reducing the flow of the river that much would kill off the fish, the reply came that fish didn't matter as much as people. Most people took a more moderate position, saying that they felt confident that this woman would not want more lives lost, or even fish for that matter. People who know the risks and accept them when they get into kayaks, they argued. People know the risks. After all, the river is not a playground for humans, it's a force of nature. And why the hysteria over this woman's body being in the river until nature could take its course? Are we in such denial about death that we can't bear the thought of seeing a person's body? And yet, I had to admit that it had unsettled me as well.
As we drove home, something nagged at me. I realized that there was something familiar about the story of the woman who drowned, the river, and the questions that her death brought up. It finally came to me, a book I had read about 10 years ago called The River Why by David James Duncan. It's a fantastic book, funny and wise, particularly if you like fish like I do. It is about a young man who is fanatically devoted to fly fishing, so much so that he retreats to a remote cabin near the coast of Oregon so that he can fish full time. One of his many adventures, he encounters the body of a drowned fisherman. He's horrified and repulsed by the man's body, and as he confronts the death, he begins to think about all the deaths that he has been responsible for as a fisherman. He wrestles with the arbitrariness of life and death, and the reality that human beings wreak havoc on every part of the earth that they inhabit. He considers the fact that even environmentally conscious people have to take other lives in order to live. He sets out on a journey in search of meaning and ultimately finds it in his beloved river, the very same river in which he found the dead fisherman. I don't want to say too much about the story because it's a fantastic read and very funny despite the seriousness of the subject. What was ringing a bell in me was the way the body in the river forced the main character to come to terms with his life. It was the river that challenged him to ask what his life meant, what all life meant, and it was the river that ultimately gave him the answer. Many of us head into the wilderness periodically for vacation, even when we know it won't necessarily be relaxing. Perhaps that's not the only point. There is something about being in a wild place that I find centering. When one is only occupied with one's own survival, less essential concerns drift away. Without the distractions of civilized life, more essential truths have the chance to surface. For example, on this trip, I was reminded that if you don't pay attention in life, you miss the small things that are wondrous. I notice that the element of risk or challenge is sometimes what makes activity fun. And yet you can never know how much risk is too much until it is too late. You can be doing something perfectly safe, just like swimming along in the river if you are a fish, and that osprey happens to pick you. A good day for the osprey turns out to be a bad day for you. A bad day fishing is a good day for the fish. In the river, you can't help but see that life is bursting all around, and yet death is a present reality. This is particularly true if you encounter a body in the water. David James Duncan reaches a similar conclusion about the wilderness. 20 years after The River Why was published, he wrote this about living most of his life next to rivers and creeks. In 45 years, he says, a river grinds millions of rocks into sand and devours a forest worth of trees, turning them into nutrients, life forms, dead forms, soil, nothingness. I haven't escaped the same forces. Rivers have turned me into someone I wouldn't be without them. And I didn't create this someone, rivers did. A life spent in the presence of reversible death and life, the presence of ceaseless hallucinogenic flow, the presence of all those impassioned and completely sincere riparian users, from the eagles to the Epheroptera, which is a mayfly. So, owls, which is a European thrush, ousel, to elk, to otters, to aspens, the presence of overarching flows of sky. When you watch all life appear, then disappear, then reappear, year in and year out, it dawns on you that you too appeared and will disappear and reappear. You perceive the weave of sacrifices that make up not just a food chain, but the universe. From those Hubble photographed trillions of miles long hydrogen clouds that give birth to stars, to the decrepit stars that explode to become planets, to a sun devouring 4 million tons of itself per second to enliven the earth, to oceans vaporizing to make clouds, snows melting to make rivers, rivers flowing to make flora, make fauna, make mayflies, that make trout, that feed not just the bodies, but the souls of fly fishers.
The weave of sacrifices that make up the universe. This is probably not an insight that I would stumble across in my suburban life, but on the river, it was so obvious. Each life is sustained by the sacrifice of other life forms, as is mine, and I, in turn, will ultimately become such a sacrifice, like the woman in the river. I think we all understand that we will die, but I know I tend to live as if it weren't so. But the river made it seem real and even normal. Instead of feeling sad or fearful, I found myself considering, if this is so, what things are worthy of my time? What or who will I give my life to until that time comes? What is really important and what can fall away? I don't know if this is true for you, but my forays into the wilderness usually end up this way. I come back with questions about meaning, and these questions arrive because I reconnect with something essentially true that I can't find in the city or in the suburbs. This particular trip helped me to realign with my calling into ministry and the vows I took to serve where I am called in the spirit of love and justice, and to seek and honor the holiness present within, among, and around us. I vowed also to wrestle with life's ambiguities and to bear witness to brokenness and grief, to love, to serve, to seek, to bear witness, to offer myself. These are the things that give my life meaning, the things that I want to spend my time doing, until such time as I am offered as a sacrifice for this universe, a sacrifice that I find worthy. So did I get my relaxing vacation? No. But I feel like I got something even more important than rest, which was reconnection. That was the gift that I found in the river, that of life transformed by sacrifice, and the dead in turn transforming the living. One soul one soul feeds another, like a mayfly feeding a trout, which in turn feeds a fisherman, who in the end may end up feeding the river. And on it goes. I hope that each of you were able to find a refuge this summer and the time to think about the things that matter most to you. And if you were able to find transformation lying on the beach with a Mai Tai, I'm a little jealous. And I'd like to talk to you about how that happened. Because at this point, we're planning a two-week rafting trip down the Colorado River, which she took. And I'm a little nervous about the transformational opportunities that we might encounter there. But for now, it's just good to be home and planning another with you. Amen to that. Okay, so please rise in body or spirit for some hymn that I don't have in front of me. Thank you.